There is no prospect that Russia is going to be able to move beyond the current territory that it holds to take not just Kyiv, but a city like Odessa.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine and also the upcoming Russian presidential election with Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at the University College in Dublin. Scott, always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me here, James.
First of all, can you just give me your assessment on where you think we are in this war at the moment?
In this Russia-Ukraine conflict, James, I think we've actually got two different aspects. One of which is the aspect that a lot of the media focuses on, which is the battlefield aspect. And in terms of that aspect, there's been very little movement for quite a long time. Uh, the initial Russian attempt to conquer Ukraine, of course, failed long ago. Ukraine has liberated a significant amount of territory, but didn't take as much as it wanted through the second half of 2023. And I think for the foreseeable future in 2024, the lines roughly remain the same in the east and in the south of the country. Ukraine certainly now is moving to a position where they talk more about active defense, to hold on to what they have regained. The Russians have been struggling for months even to regain this one town called Avdiivka, which they've razed, leveled to the ground in the Donetsk region. So in that sense, I think you have to move to the second broader aspect of the battlefield of the war and say, well, in a sense, it's one beyond the battlefield. And that brings in political and economic as well as military considerations. I think you can start with the significant shift in terms of the Ukrainian attacks behind the front lines. Uh, Quite a lot of daily press, we understand why, is on the Russian missile and drone strikes, which sometimes hit Ukrainian infrastructure, but more often than not wind up killing civilians. What has been interesting is that while Ukraine has resisted, those many months of attempts to break it from the air, they now are hitting Russian positions inside Russia and in occupied Crimea within the space of 1 week, hitting 4 oil refineries inside Russia and in Crimea, for example. They've hit Russia's naval facilities and warships hard, in effect breaking Russia's hold on part of the Black Sea. They have hit Russian air bases and indeed at the same time have shot down a series of Russian warplanes in the sky. And in the latest incident, one which did garner a bit of attention, a Russian transport plane, an IL-76, being shot down in Russia with differing claims as to whether it was carrying Russian missiles or parts from missiles or Ukrainian prisoners of war. So that's a shift. Ukraine, in a sense, is wearing down Russian capabilities, or at least checking them with the war behind the front lines. And then you've got the political and the economic aspects. You have these ongoing discussions, which are about the ongoing aid to Ukraine. And while a lot of attention is focused to Vladimir Putin's de facto allies, the Republicans in the US, Viktor Orban in Hungary, a lot of countries have stepped up even in recent weeks with more commitments of aid. France, Germany, the Baltic states, Norway, Denmark, just to name a few. And then, of course, you have this political effort, which is to bring Ukraine on the path to the EU and into NATO, which is continuing, along with, I think, confirmation very soon that, and who could have foreseen this 2 years ago, that Sweden will become the 32nd member of NATO in the near future.
We'll come on to NATO's role in this conflict in a moment, Scott. But in terms of the political landscape, who does it favour the most at the moment, Ukraine or Russia? Because there's narrative around a stalemate almost on the battlefield, and I know that's disputed, that language, by some people, but that narrative has taken hold. A lot of people suggesting that actually works for Vladimir Putin, who can use it to create this idea that Western aid for Ukraine is futile. And yet, as you say, there have been significant attacks perpetrated by Ukraine against Russia, victories for Ukraine in recent months. So where do you see the politics at the moment? Who does it favour the most?
Well, Vladimir Putin's hope now is for almost an information, or we might call it a disinformation war, to break support for Ukraine. That's what he now has to resort to. Because again, to give that essential context, phase one in 2022, spring of 2022, he fails to overwhelm Kyiv, and his forces have to withdraw from northern Ukraine by the end of April 2022. By the end of 2022, they have actually been driven out of part of eastern Ukraine. Phase two, all right, we'll break Ukraine with the food war. We'll blockade its ports. That effort has collapsed. His attempt even to revive the blockade last summer has failed, and you now have Ukraine's exports of grain higher, higher than they were before the February 2022 invasion. Phase three, the energy war, over the winter of 2022-23, knocked out half of Ukraine's power grid at one point, but Ukraine recovered and it bolstered its air defenses. So even the Russian attacks this winter, which continue to take a heavy toll on civilian lives, have not threatened to freeze Ukraine. So where does he go now? He goes with the idea of playing upon this idea, this narrative that the Ukrainian counteroffensive failed. Something we can discuss, but you play upon that to say, well, Ukraine's never going to defeat me, so you should stop supporting it. And as I said, there are certain allies of his, political allies, Viktor Orban within the EU, still holding up 50 billion euros in aid to Ukraine through 2027. The Republicans in the US, who I don't think are open allies of Putin, but are doing his work for him by holding Ukrainian aid hostage. And his big hope in this information political war is Donald Trump gets into the White House, which we can also discuss if you wish. So all of that's out there because he's creating this specter of you can't beat me, you can't beat me, so you should give it up. When in fact the reality is that you have seen in terms of the adults in the room, this ongoing commitment, which is, all right, we have got to make sure that Putin cannot turn the information warfare into an effective battlefield victory because we abandoned support. A lot of this is done through bilateral agreements in terms of armor, artillery, in terms of air defenses, in terms now of the impending provision of the US made F-16 jet fighters. Some of it will come through the European Union or through other bodies like the World Bank, the G7, etc. The reason why it doesn't quite get across to people that it's happening out there is, what do you want more, a dramatic headline, which says stalemate, or the practical realities, which is in a step-by-step, a marathon, not a sprint basis, that you have this galvanized international community, for the most part, still saying to Ukraine, look, you may not regain all of your territory, but you will not be abandoned to allow Kyiv to fall to Putin.
You mentioned the information warfare we're seeing at the moment, Scott. Does that explain, as far as you're concerned, some of the rhetoric we're seeing coming out of the Kremlin? I mean, I was struck recently, there were comments from the director of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, Sergei Narishkin, who reiterated that the Kremlin isn't interested in any settlements short of the complete destruction and eradication of the Ukrainian state. Is that ramped up rhetoric part of that information warfare you were talking about?
It is part of the information warfare, but that from the foreign intelligence, how the foreign intelligence services, of course, a lot of it's for a domestic audience, who after 2 years of war is going, oh, wait a minute, we were supposed to have won this. And when that happens, what you get is the Kremlin speaking out of both sides of its mouth. Because remember, Vladimir Putin's official line, and Sergei Lavrov is very skilled, and I use skilled in the sense of a very pernicious way, foreign minister, will say, oh, well, we'll negotiate. We'll negotiate peace with Ukraine. We'll negotiate. Now, of course, when they negotiate peace with Ukraine, they mean a peace which allows Russia to hold on to about the 18% of Ukraine which it has seized, either in 2014 or in 2022. They mean a peace which effectively means that Ukraine has no hope of regaining that territory, through nonviolent means, let alone through a renewed conflict. And then you get these comments on the other side, not just from the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, but from the former president, Dmitry Medvedev, from hardline legislators, who effectively say, Ukraine must be vanquished. We must defeat the Nazis. We must overwhelm them. And then you realize, when you hear those voices, yeah, Vladimir Putin is effectively playing Mr. Nice Guy on the one hand to a Western audience, and then pointing to his people back home and going, you know what? Still going to win. Still going to win. Still going to win.
And his desire to play to a domestic audience in Russia is really interesting, and that brings us on to what's happening in a couple of months now, the Russian presidential elections. And what's interesting is that no one's in any doubt as to what the results of those elections will be. But given that, why does Vladimir Putin care so much about how they go?
Because it's pretend legitimacy. Now, let's say at the outset that there are a lot of Russians who support Vladimir Putin. And it is quite likely that if this was a free and fair election, Vladimir Putin can win. But Vladimir Putin wants to win with 75, 80, 85% of the vote. That's the consistent pattern. So what the Kremlin does is they say, all right, we're going to have months of campaigning. Here we go. And Vladimir Putin shows up at his rallies, and then you set up some other candidates. Now, some of the candidates are almost like in-house candidates who know they're not going to win, but they get a chance to, pretend that their parties are important, et cetera. Let's talk about the Communist Party, for example, who's still around and whose likely candidate, just after they announced they're running in the elections, was on screen on TV talking to Vladimir Putin. How are you, Mr. Putin? Good to meet you. I worry about you when I see you without a jacket in the cold, meeting the people, being adored by the people, because I fear for your health. In other words, of saying, I'm running against you, but hey, you're the number one guy. Then you have these other candidates that are put up almost as spoiler candidates. And what they do is they make the pretense that, in a sense, they are, quote, maybe economically liberal, not using liberal in the sense of, politically liberal, but economically liberal, or that they have slightly different views on certain domestic issues. And those campaigns are managed by the Kremlin. And one of the infamous examples is a socialite named Ksenia Sobchak, who ran in 2018, a bit of a social media star, ran forth. And it later came out that she had been in meetings with the Kremlin all along about the campaign. So when you get into 2024, and we can discuss the details as you get to it, the Kremlin had this choice, which is they know Putin's going to win. So what's the number they want to put on the victory in terms of the percentage? And how much space do they want to give not only to other parties, like, for example, the New People's Party or the Communist Party, but to a candidate who might be economically liberal or even present a different view on the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, it's interesting you mention candidates who may present a different view on the war in Ukraine. And I wanted to ask you specifically about who is being labelled as an anti-war opposition candidate called Boris Nemtsov. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. What do you know about him?
So I'm going to tell you a story and hope we have enough time for it because it tells you about the intricacies of these Russian politics and then how they present it internationally. Boris Nemtsov is a career politician. He has been around since just after the Soviet Union fell, part of that new generation of politicians in terms of which way was Russia going to go. And he positioned himself as, again, an economic liberal. And an economic liberal is someone that doesn't believe as much in centralized control of the economy, that you decentralize it. You have a lot of what you might call, quote, Western practices in terms of the financial community, the banking community, as well as in business. At one point, however, he shifted from being an economic liberal to cozying up to what are called Russian nationalists. Now, Russian nationalists, not just the love of Mother Russia, but quite often can have a very harsh rhetoric against those who aren't Russian, can even be xenophobic. And so he was pushed out of what was called the Right Cause Party about a decade ago because he had these nationalist sentiments. He repositions himself again over the past decade, again embraces a bit of economic liberalism. He reportedly has ambitions to get back into either Moscow government or into the Duma, Russia's lower house of parliament. So what he says here is, in last autumn, is, you know what, might make a run for president. Now, there's an essential context for this. According to the independent Russian website Medusa, which I believe is a very reliable website, Medusa tells a story that in early 2023, the Kremlin decided, look, should we run a liberal candidate, and even a candidate who might be opposed to the ongoing invasion of Ukraine, should we run that and let that person get a little bit of the vote just to show that we allow a variety of views? Because they know a lot of people in Russia are tired of the war. They know a lot of people, as we've seen through the demonstrations, like the Mothers and Wives demonstrations, want it to end. They rejected that. The Kremlin's information bloc in the fall of 2023, however, got word that Nadezhdin wanted to run. And they had discussions with him. Okay, you're going to run. How are you going to run? What's your message going to be, etc.? Do we actually get involved with coordinating the campaign with you? The Kremlin's political bloc rejected that. They didn't want to get that close to Nadezhdin, right? But here's where their miscalculation came in. The prospect of his candidacy gathered more support than they expected. And so now Nadezhdin has gathered up to 200,000 signatures, and he's thinking, you know what? I'm not going to drop out of this race. I might genuinely have, not going to win, but enough support it's going to propel my political career. And so the Kremlin now faces this uncomfortable choice. Do they quash Nadezhdin, which makes very clear that they're shutting down the space because he has said not that he's against the invasion of Ukraine, but that he favors peace to Ukraine to end the war now. Hasn't said exactly what the terms of the peace would be. So there is that little bit of difference from the Kremlin. Do they try to shut that down, which would make them look bad in terms of closing off that option, or do they allow him to run and run the risk that he can galvanize not a majority of Russians, but a notable minority of Russians that will support his views enough that the Kremlin has to work harder to manipulate and massage the election so that Vladimir Putin still gets his 75-80% vote share.
That's really interesting. And I suppose the thing that I keep sort of asking myself is, when we talk about the Kremlin wanting to appear like they're allowing a range of views, who are they speaking to there? Because clearly people in the West know that it's all a load of baloney and that it's a rigged election. Presumably other world leaders know the same. Who are they anxious to communicate that to?
Well, they do have a pool of supportive activists in the West, including here in the UK, who are very keen on amplifying their messages, whether it be on Ukraine, whether it be on Russia's role in, the killing of hundreds of thousands of people in Syria, whether it's Russia's position as part of this new supposedly bloc that is going to get rid of the US dollar. And so it's a message those activists like to cling on to, hold on to. Russia does have a space, especially in terms of trying to build up relationships, let's say, with what we call the global South, which does have a range of countries that have, you know, elections, have supposedly democratic systems. So you project it to that. But then you also project it internally, because I think too often outside of Russia, we get this view of either it's this all or nothing. Either all Russians are going to rise up against this war and Mr. Putin's going to be gone, or all of them are absolutely almost like on strings pulled by the Russian state. And, Russia's a country of 143 million people. It's a vast country with a whole range of communities, whole range of different ethnic groups, different nationalities, and a whole range of opinions. And so to simply go out and put Putin up there as president for life and do it without any other candidate out there would be too blatant. It wouldn't give that space for that range of views to at least vent itself just a bit. And so therefore you do offer, that range of candidates while in a sense keeping that range of candidates within certain parameters. So I don't even think Nadezhdin is going to come out and say, for example, Russia should give up Crimea, which is occupied since 2014. I think if he knows he said that, not only would he not be running for president, he could be facing a court pretty quickly. We're not going to see Alexei Navalny come out of prison probably for decades, or at least as long as Vladimir Putin is in power, because Navalny is a true, genuine voice in terms of opposing Putin on a whole range of issues. So you have sort of that managed space, whereas it's not like the old days of, Russia State Channel 1 and Russia State Channel 2, where the guy on Russia State Channel 2 says turn to Channel 1. There are a range of outlets out there, although a lot of outlets have been shut down. And I guess the best way of saying it is if you let a little bit of steam, if you turn the valve and let a little bit of steam off of that to give the pretense that you're listening to people, then you don't face a major rebellion if things are going wrong.
I wanted to ask you, Scott, about the reports we've had recently that NATO chiefs think we should be doing more to plan for a future conflict with Russia. There's been a lot of focus on the risk that the Baltic states are under. I mean, separately also looking at what Russia's doing in terms of trying to destabilise politics in Moldova and trying to maybe disrupt their entry into the EU, I think is interesting as well. How do you assess the risk of a conflict, a full-scale conflict between NATO or the West, however you want to phrase it, and Russia in the years to come?
I think you framed that question very well, because we're not talking in the sense that NATO is planning for a hot war in the sense of a World War III, if you think about it, with exchanges of conventional and nuclear weapons all along the European front, a prospect that certain tabloids in the UK and in Germany have been playing up in the past week. What we're talking about is this full spectrum conflict, if you might call about it, which is, for example, let's talk about cyber warfare. And the Russians have been involved in cyber warfare for quite some time. They've used it to interfere in elections, including in the United States, as well as across Europe. They've used it to try to undermine companies, to disrupt public services. So you've got to prepare for that. The Russians have continued to try to pursue coup attempts in various countries. Moldova is one, which has, again, alongside Ukraine, possibly a future member of the EU, uh, that gets a lot of Russian attention because they want to prevent that from occurring. You can talk about Russia trying to wage what we talk about, this information warfare through disinformation, as well as through, cultivating ranges groups of activists. So that's the type of thing that you have to prepare for across all fronts. And what has happened is that it's not really the prospect that the Russians will go and invade the Baltic states next week or next month or invade Poland. It is that they will try to put economic pressure or social pressure on, even to the extent of the current threat of just sending refugees and asylum seekers and migrants who are desperate, who want someplace to go. And Russia just simply says, go to Finland. And the whole idea that you could overwhelm Finland with hundreds of thousands of people that they can't cope with. Any good military has to prepare for the worst. That has always been done. What Vladimir Putin has done with the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 is galvanize minds in thinking of what is that worst case scenario? How desperate could he get? Or how adventurous could he get? And realizing that, of course, we've got new members of NATO. Finland has come in, Sweden soon to join. Make sure that everybody is on the same page as we go into 2024 and 2025.
But it's interesting how the narrative around what Putin's aims are have shifted over the past year or so, because a year ago it seemed like people were saying what Putin really wanted was to save face in Ukraine and present something as a victory to the Russian people. Now we've returned to his wider, what was being speculated about in 2021 or 2022, sorry, when the full-scale invasion began, that actually he wanted a wider conflict to destabilize the West more broadly and to reassert a greater Russia. Are we almost moving back to that?
Well, in a way we are, but I want to break that question down to realize what we're talking about is not Putin acting out of strength, but Putin out of weakness. The reason why you have to prepare that Vladimir Putin is going to go try to destabilize the West is because he did not capture Kyiv. He did not install a puppet government in Ukraine. There is no prospect that Russia is going to be able to move beyond the current territory that it holds to take not just Kyiv, but a city like Odessa on the Black Sea, or to take Dnipro in the center of the country. Not going to happen. So Putin has to go back to the fact that, all right, I'm going to try to hold on to what I have, this 18% of Ukraine, and then what I'm going to do is try to just simply erode the West, break it down politically, economically, socially. That pre-2022 strategy. And you have to be ready for that. I think, in other words, what you've highlighted, James, just what every question is how he miscalculated in February 2022. If he had continued with what he was doing, which was the unsettling of political systems, economies, information systems, I think he could have gradually eroded Europe. He could have weakened Europe. He could not only have undermined Ukraine, he could have undermined many other countries. What he did in February 2022 was, by highlighting the threat, is he actually galvanized a lot of people to say, wait a minute, now we got to start understanding what is going on here. In other words, he was too blatant. He was too blatant in exposing what his real aims are. Now he goes back to, hey, I'm a nice guy. Trust me.
Let's talk about Donald Trump. He appears to be now the overwhelming favourite to be the Republican nominee once again. Were he to return to the White House, how would that change the entire picture?
The caveat I'm going to continue to give, as long as Nikki Haley, the other Republican candidates in the race, is that the fat lady hasn't sung, that American expression. And so until we get to Super Tuesday, the first week in March, that race still goes on. And the reason why that's important, to set up the answer to your question, is the reason why Nikki Haley stays in the race is not necessarily she thinks she can win at this point, but because there are a lot of Republicans, let alone independents, who are unsettled by Donald Trump across a range of issues, not just his legal problems, but a range of political issues, including what he would do to U.S. foreign policy. So Nikki Haley, in a sense, is being encouraged by adults in the room to keep on challenging it. Now, let us assume, however, that Trump does become the Republican nominee. Uh, the general election is not a foregone conclusion. Trump and Biden run neck and neck in the opinion polls. Indeed, if the Republicans were serious about defeating Biden, Nikki Haley is a far stronger candidate. But the threat is that if Donald Trump does win the White House and is inaugurated as U.S. president in January 2025 and is allowed to take the presidency because he has either not been convicted or because he finds a way to pardon himself, Vladimir Putin's got his guy in the White House. And we need to be very honest there. And he's got his guy in the White House in the immediate sense that Donald Trump hates the Zelensky government. Hates this, and let's just have the quick flashback. Beyond actually supporting Vladimir Putin's line on the seizure of Crimea and indeed parts of eastern Ukraine, Donald Trump in 2019 blackmailed the Zelensky government and said, no military aid until you dish dirt on my prospective opponent, Joe Biden. Something for which he got caught, in which he was impeached but saved from conviction by the Republican majority in the Senate. But that's how far he went. In 2020, and this is on record from an EU commissioner named Thierry Breton, it's on record by a guy who I was alongside him on a panel last week, and he confirmed it yet again, the Irish commissioner to the EU, Phil Hogan. Trump said, you're on your own, folks. We're coming out of NATO. If Donald Trump came in 2025, it is not just the prospect that he bails on Ukraine. He will try to bail on NATO, and he will resume the campaign which he pursued unsuccessfully, well, with partial success, because there's a connection with Boris Johnson. I can tell you sometime if you buy me a beer. He is going to continue the campaign to undermine and break up the EU. Donald Trump will do that not because he has a coherent vision of American foreign policy, American aims, but because Donald Trump pursues the ego of Donald Trump. And he does not like anyone that criticizes him or does not take his line on foreign policy or his own personal position. And that will include Europe. It includes NATO. It includes any multilateral organization. And that's what people are preparing for. I mean, that's what European governments are preparing for. It's what governments in Asia are preparing for. It's what the UN is preparing for. The rules of the game will be ripped up if Trump comes back into the White House.
Scott Lucas, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us on Frontline today.
Thanks to you, James. Thanks to all your great listeners.